Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community. Listen to the podcast. You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. I was with our guest in China. It seemed like yesterday, quite a while ago. It was I think one of the most influential Orthodox Jewish attorneys in the country. In fact, he is Akiva Shapiro. He's been named to City and State in New York's inaugural 2024, 40 in their 40s, and he's listed as New York's 40-something power player. One of them, he's chair of Gibson, Dunn's New York's administrative law and regulatory practice. He deals with constitutional, administrative, commercial issues. He has been working on a lot of Jewish issues, very active in the Jewish community. He has worked on cases with recovery of assets and artwork seized during the Holocaust by Germany and Hungary. He's represented Shomer Shabbos, that's Sabbath observant, Maranter B.D. Deutsch, and he's also involved with Aguna. But right now he has a very fascinating case dealing with an Iranian, with a Kurdish woman who's suing Hezbollah and suing the terrorist group. So, Akiva, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Sure, pleasure to be here. Great to see you again.
But as I was with you and Allison Joseph, of course, gets a lot of publicity, but you also get a lot because you've done so much. So we're really honored that you're joining us. So there's so much to talk about, but the case that intrigued me is the lawsuit that you're bringing on behalf of a Kurdish woman against Hezbollah. Tell us about it.
Sure. So this is a case that we filed just last week, actually. So it's hot off the presses. And we filed a lawsuit in federal court in Virginia on behalf of this woman, Sarah Salim, who's a Kurdish woman, Kurdish-born, now a U.S. citizen, though. She was kidnapped by Hezbollah and another Iranian-backed terrorist group called AAH, and in a conspiracy together with the former prime minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, and some others. And the story here is it really is out of a spy novel, how she was kidnapped and then how she escaped. It's an incredible story. And I'll tell you the story, and then we can talk about the bigger picture implications of what this means for the Jewish community, for lawsuits against terrorists, and some other recent news that it connects with. But I just think the story itself is kind of wild. So she's from a prominent Kurdish family, prominent Kurdish developer and businesswoman. And one day in September 2014, she climbed into her car in Basra, Iraq. Basra was kind of famous as a battle site during the war many years before. And she was suddenly surrounded by 4 cars bearing the insignia of the prime minister of Iraq. 20 armed men jumped out, surrounded her, pulled her out of her car, and dragged her away. Next thing she knows, she's in a little apartment building, She doesn't know where it is, but she's trying to piece together who abducted her and how and why. And eventually she figures out that it's Hezbollah and this AAH group. They're trying to extort her for $2 million.
Was she an affluent woman?
She was an affluent woman.
What did she do?
She's a builder.
A builder, okay.
So she was building a very significant project in the area, a $100 million project, 2,500 secure homes. So it's kind of a secure facility in these secure homes. And they wanted to extort her to get money from her to get cut into the project, but also they accused her of being a CIA and a Mossad spy. So it's sort of one of these things where on the one hand, there was a commercial and a monetary element. On the other hand, the Kurdish community was very strongly against both the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein and was terribly persecuted and is now terribly persecuted by the Turkish government and the Erdogan government. They are Sunnis largely, so there's a significant conflict between them and the Shia-backed Iranian regime and Hezbollah and those other terrorist groups. So there's a lot that was kind of going on, but she was held anyways for 43 days in this little apartment, starved, beaten. They tortured her. They tried to extract information from her. At the end of the 43 days, and she's an engineer also, the whole time they were giving her food with plasticware. One morning, they gave her a metal spoon, and after she ate her breakfast, she secreted it away. She stuck it away in her pocket. They didn't realize. And that night, she went into the bathroom, and she used the metal spoon to cut away around the window frame, all the way around, and dislodge the window frame.
That's her engineering came into play.
Came into play, saved her. She pushed the window out of the window frame. She saw she was on a third floor part of a building, a third floor. There was a drain pipe. She shimmied down the drain pipe, got to the second floor, jumped from one rooftop to the next until she found a way to get down to the first floor. And by the time the terrorists realized that she was missing, chased after her. She called the police, and the president of Iraq, who was in a conflict with the prime minister, one was Shia and one was Kurdish, sent forces, and there was this gun battle in the streets. Anyway, she eventually escaped, came to America, became a U.S. citizen, built herself back up, and decided she wants to finally bring some justice, use the American legal system to go after her kidnappers, her torturers, and find some measure of justice. So that's why I came in.
Before I get to the trial and what you're trying to do, she can make a movie, make a fortune too. Sounds like a wonderful Hollywood movie too, right? Is she considering that as well?
Every person I've spoken to since I took the case has said the same thing. So I think I got to find a producer and a writer maybe and make it happen, because I think
maybe I can speak to your wife Allison. She's in touch with all the Hollywood types now.
It's true. It's true. Well, not only is it a good story, but I think it's really good for us to have that kind of storytelling out there, to have those stories in the mass media that show heroes fighting back against terrorism. We've seen many of the post-October 7th movies that have been very powerful, but I think we can continue those stories, continue those movie making. It's a good message and a good story, so it's a win-win.
Absolutely. I think it'll be commercially very viable. But let me ask you this question. She was kidnapped, abducted by these terrorists in 2014. Is there a statute of limitations when you can sue? Forget the fact it's being done in the United States, which is a whole different story, but isn't there a statute of limitations on it? Or is there?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. It's a good question. So Congress has been very active in trying to open up the U.S. courts to terror victims and to torture victims. So there's two separate federal statutes, one called the Torture Victims Protection Act that allows U.S. citizens to file lawsuits in federal court, even for being victims of torture abroad. And it cuts away many of the procedural problems that you sometimes have in bringing these cases. And then there's another statute called the Anti-Terrorism Act, which also is a very broad statute allowing U.S. citizens and others to file suit in U.S. courts. And so without getting to the technicalities too much, both of these statutes have 10-year statute of limitations. However, because she was not a U.S. citizen previously, the statute of limitations doesn't start until she becomes a U.S. citizen for one of the statutes, and for another one, until the defendants come to the U.S., the statute of limitations doesn't start. So they're both built to allow victims in this situation to be able to bring cases in U.S. courts.
Funny you should mention it. I was talking to Steve Flater, who got money unfortunately, for his daughter, Elisa, killed by terrorists. But there have been times with the U.S. government, even though it's on the books that you want to go after these terrorist governments like Iran and others, and other times where they really don't want the victims to go after, right? That depends against who's in power.
It's very frustrating because Congress has been very good about this consistently. They passed law after law trying to provide for this, but both the executive branch, the presidents and secretaries of state under administrations of both parties have often intervened in these cases to say that it's going to create a matter of, a political issue or a foreign policy issue in allowing the cases to advance. So they're kind of in a clash between Congress that wants to expand these cases and the executive branch that doesn't. And even more frustratingly for me as a lawyer, the courts, including the Supreme Court, have, I would say, extended themselves often to undo the things that Congress has wanted to do. So there's been many cases where Congress has passed a law allowing for these kind of cases, goes up to the Supreme Court, and then they find very narrowly to disallow these kinds of claims. So, for example, there was a case that somebody sued the Palestinian Authority and the PLO for terrorism under the Anti-Terrorism Act, went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that that statute is only available against individual terrorists, individual persons, not against terrorist groups. There was a reading of the statute that allowed them to get there, but it was a very frustrating result that I think is totally contrary to the congressional intent. Like, if you had asked the Congress members, when you're passing this Anti-Terrorism Act, can you sue the PLO, a terrorist organization? They, of course, would have said yes, that's what it's there for. And yet they're, come up with these kind of technicalities to get out of it.
So can Congress pass legislation to change that, to make it more clear? But that's something that should be on the books? Yeah,
and they can, and they actually have in various instances, not in that specific case. I would love that if they would. There's this kind of dance happening between the courts and Congress, where the courts narrow these statutes, Congress goes back and expands them, and the court narrows them again. And so we've been in that dance also in the Holocaust recovery setting that's happened. So it's an ongoing process, but yes, Congress, and I'm hopeful in this Congress that's coming up, that this is going to be one of those things that's priority, is to address some of these decisions where Congress has the authority, because it's not a constitutional issue. It's not like there's some constitutional problem. It's just the courts interpreting statutes in a certain way.
Our guest is top Orthodox Jewish attorney Akiva Shapiro, is with Gibson, Dunn. He's involved in constitutional, administrative, commercials, very much involved in the Jewish community. He's litigating a case regarding a Kurdish woman suing the terrorist group Hezbollah for abducting her in 2014. So I know that there's also connection in that, and I think Jewish groups are watching this case, Akiva, because if you're successful and she's successful, it opens the door. For example, the murderers of the Chabad rabbi just the other day, right? Does that open the door?
Yeah, it certainly does.
Tzvi Kogan from Chabad was killed in UAE.
Yeah, it's it's obviously a horrible, tragic event. And I wish we weren't in the situation where we had to find, justice through the courts. It's only a very tiny, small measure of justice that can ever really fully address these kinds of terrible tragedies. But I do hope, and we are trying to keep the pressure on Hezbollah and these groups with these kind of lawsuits, and also to expand the avenues in U.S. courts, like you said, to create good precedent that will pave the way for other victims of terror in other situations, including many times in the Jewish community, to be able to bring these lawsuits, these kinds of claims in U.S. courts. And kind of on a personal level, you mentioned Rabbi Kogan and his abduction and his murder. I filed this lawsuit on this past Friday, and I found out that same day that he had been abducted in the UAE, and it felt to me like there was something, there's a connection there, in part because Rabbi Kogan's uncle and aunt were Rabbi Gavriel and Rivka Holtzberg, who, if you remember, were murdered
in November
2008 in Mumbai. And when that happened, we had just our oldest son had just been born. He was born on November 26th, 2008. So the same exact day that the Holtzbergs were murdered. And when I heard about that, I think it was that Friday night, sitting in shul, hearing the rabbi speak about their murder, I thought to myself, really it would be a beautiful thing to name our son after Rabbi Gavriel Holtzberg. So we already had two names for our son, Rui Yitzchak, and we added Gavriel as the third name. And so
special.
And we tell him about who he's named for, and it's it's a very meaningful thing for him, for us. But unfortunately, this cycle, that was 16 years ago, right? November 26th, 2008. Wow. And unfortunately, we're still in this battle. We're still in this war. And I think in a certain sense, it's become more and more clarified as time goes on, of course, after October 7th, but also in really recent weeks and days, that on the one side, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the terrorist groups, and on the other side, all the freedom-loving, good people of the world. And the forces of evil, they've really been aligned from 2008 and before, long before. But I think more recently, we see how clearly they are coordinating, sending troops to one another, sending money to one another in this kind of axis of evil. And I think it's just a reminder to us that we also have to unify on the other side.
Axis of good, we need that.
Exactly.
Now, walk us through. By the way, is there any Jewish groups that suing Hamas or Israeli groups suing Hamas after October 7th that you know about?
Yeah, there are a couple very significant lawsuits, which I'm certainly watching for victims of October 7th, including many U.S. citizens who have brought lawsuits in the United States. There's a lawsuit that was brought against Hamas. There was another lawsuit that was brought against Iran for its and Qatar for their state support for Hamas. So that there's definitely a lot of activity in that space, and I'm hopeful that we'll see some good results there.
Now, sometimes you mentioned the courts sometimes have very narrow definitions, wouldn't allow victims of terrorism to collect money. Some of the administrations are not happy about it too. From what I recall, some of the administration wants to get, for example, Iran's good side, don't want to release the money, right? So they can also put up roadblocks and have put up roadblocks.
They have. This is another instance, though, where there has been some activity in the good direction. So there's a fund now specifically for Iranian for basically people who have money judgments against Iran. And so if you get a money judgment against Iran, there is a pot of money to collect from, and they've that's been kind of collected from various Iranian assets. Even so, collecting a judgment on these kinds of cases is very difficult. I kind of think of it as like step by step. Let's just get into court. Let's get everyone served. Let's get a decision in our favor. Let's get a judgment.
I would assume under a Trump administration might be easier than under a Biden administration to collect money from Iran or Hezbollah. I would assume that.
Yeah, I think likely so, and I think likely there will be less roadblocks as far as the State Department intervening to create issues there, and I think there's another opportunities there on the political front to engage Congress and the administration. Because it's one, in a sense, it's a low-hanging fruit. Like, who doesn't hate terrorists and want justice for them?
There are a lot of calculations some of the elected officials and unfortunately governments that have. Walk me through, how long does it take? You file a lawsuit, and how does it work? I'm sure it can last years, could last decades. Give us a time frame.
Yeah, so it certainly can last years and decades, although it doesn't have to necessarily. I think for these defendants, they're all overseas. They're not showing up in the United States.
Shows up for Hezbollah. Nasrallah's there. Who shows up? They may be afraid to, so they just hire lawyers, or they just ignore it.
So we have to find ways to serve them. That's kind of the first step.
Maybe Israel can do it. They're in Lebanon now anyway. Well, at least they were.
Yeah, there you go. Send one of the Golani guys out to the base to give somebody by service a process and see if someone can hand that off. That's a good idea.
Out of curiosity, if a Hezbollah leader is served and then he's assassinated, does that mean that you have to serve it again to somebody else? How does that work legally?
It's a good question. I don't think there's too much law developed there. You've got a high enough Hezbollah person that can, represent the organization. But look, there are various ways to serve kind of difficult to serve individuals. We can get permission from the court to email them. Many of them have been represented by lawyers in the past in other cases, so we can serve those lawyers. We can serve the embassies. The Nouri al-Maliki, the former prime minister of Iraq, has assets in a lot of places, and he is potentially reachable. There's some other individuals that are defendants that are less well known, but also travel, to various places around the world and can be served. So we've got to serve everyone. That's kind of step number one, or get the court's permission to get them served. And then either they're going to show up and fight it, or they're not, and that it's hard to know what's going to happen here.
So do they want to fight it because in most cases they're going to lose? So, and then they're going to make it difficult to try to collect anyway. So, do they want to spend resources to defend it, knowing they're in all likely they're going to lose?
Yeah, a lot of times they don't. a lot of times they won't show up. We'll get a default judgment. You know, the plaintiff will get a default judgment, and then when they finally try to collect on that judgment, then the people will show. You know, then the defense will show up to try to fight it at that point. This is also just like a pet peeve of mine. I think the law should be that if you choose not to show up in court and not to fight the case at the opportunity that you have, you shouldn't have the opportunity to later come in and say, oh, now that you got a judgment against me, I'm going to fight it now. That just seems like, especially for kind of bad actor.
So would you need Congress to enact that rule? Could the judges impose that?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, it would have to be a congressional act. You know,
maybe now's the time to get that done. In the few moments that have remaining, one of the cases that I watched over the years was the Tufsky case, a family that gave birth 20-some years ago, the child in Jerusalem. The State Department refused to register the child as being born in Jerusalem. They listed Jerusalem without being Israel. I know that Lewin represented. I know you were involved in the case. It finally got resolved during the first Trump presidency. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so this was a great experience for me and a great result at the end of the day. Nat Lewin was my law school professor, religious minorities in Supreme Court litigation. I took his class at Columbia. So it was a great class, and that's how my first introduction to the Supreme Court. We went down to the court for an argument and met Justice Scalia there, who was an old law school classmate of Nat Lewin's. So when Nat was representing Zivotofsky, the family, the kid, when the Supreme Court took the case, I said, oh, that's my old law professor, and it's Israel, it's foreign relations, it's constitutional issues. This is great. So long story short, I ended up representing members of Congress as friends of the court, amici. So we wrote a friend of the court brief supporting Zivotofsky's position. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, you just never know how the law is going to, and the politics are going to wind their way through. So long story short, at the end of the day, we lost the case. We were trying to say that Congress had the authority. Congress had passed this law telling the president and the State Department, if somebody's born in Israel, they can choose to put Israel on their passports. If they're born in Jerusalem, they can choose to put Israel on their passports. The president said, I'm not doing that. And we lost the case. The Supreme Court said, it's up to the president to decide. It's not up to Congress to decide.
Which president was in power at that time?
So at that time, it was passed under both. So President Bush, George W. Bush, was the first, and the first president that did not enforce this, and then President Obama as well also didn't enforce it. So that was another one of those kind of cross administration.
But did it become a mute point? Because I know that President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel as far as having the embassy. But did that officially make that the case? Where I couldn't get this from Nat Lewin. If Tufsky automatically could be registered Jerusalem, Israel, that would still be a gray area.
So that's the interesting thing is the Supreme Court said, okay, the president gets to decide, and then President Trump came into power and said, well, I get to decide. Okay, so I'm deciding that if you're born in Jerusalem, you can write Israel.
Did he say that?
They did, yes. They officially changed
the
foreign policy. And another interesting personal connection, my oldest daughter, Meira, was born in Jerusalem, American citizen, had an American passport that said Jerusalem on it, not Israel. After the case was over and President Trump changed the policy, she went and she got her passport reissued to say Israel on it. And I felt very, proud about having a connection to that story.
Do other parents who have children born in Israel have the same problem?
So yeah, for for all those decades, right? We didn't fight it
but today, if somebody
today now the policy
automatically says Jerusalem, Israel.
You can choose if you're born in Jerusalem. You can choose to say Jerusalem or Israel. It's up to the parent's choice, or the child. I guess it would be the parent. I mean, the child is a baby, so parent's choice. Interestingly, that was not changed under the Biden administration. I guess they decided the path was already set there, so they left it. So that remains a legacy from the first Trump term.
I want to thank you, Akiva Shapiro, one of the top Orthodox Jewish attorneys in the country involved in constitutional issues. And as you heard, a fascinating case regarding a Kurdish woman suing Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups are being abducted. And this has implications for Jewish groups as well. So thank you for work that you're doing on behalf of all of us, including the Jewish community. Look forward to having you back again.
Thanks. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Regards to Allison.
Sure thing.
Thank you for tuning in to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
On Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.